I am going to talk about COVID and climate change, and I'm just going to talk about things for about 15 minutes. And so before we open up to a conversation, but I wanted to actually touch base first with what is going on both in Great Britain and the United States, because they speak the strategies that are presently in play are much part of the larger kind of global context in which the kind of expropriation that has developed that has pushed the emergence of COVID and climate change both. Just to speak about COVID in Great Britain, I'm sure many of you are well aware of what's going on presently, but we have at about 144,000 deaths in total. You're back up at 45,000 new COVID cases a day, with winter only beginning. Get 45 deaths a day presently. You're at about 76% of people who've gotten the first dose of the vaccine, 69% of the second, and 23% of the third. By far beyond what most countries are in the world. But at the same time, unlikely to provide the herd immunity that was so bandied about over the past year and a half. We have the Delta variant, the Delta Plus variants being much more infectious. They have the deadliness of an influenza and the infectivity of the common cold. And so what that does is it put pressure on societies to get up to something like the kind of combination of vaccination and infection of 90 to 95% of your population in order for any kind of even passing herd immunity to kick in place. There were reports back as far as last October, October 2020, showing out in Brazil. Northern Brazil, they were able to track infection rates as being up as high as 75%, and still the outbreak raged, in part because herd immunity, in effect, at this point, is more of a good idea rather than something that actually takes place in all likelihood, because of the way people are. Their antibody coverage kind of goes in decline, and they return back into the pool of susceptibles. Also, the increasing capacity of the infection to evolve out from underneath it, not only as new variants, but just in generally just getting out from underneath the antibody response. So, in part, this is all made problematic by the fact that the vaccines were used as a kind of political signal of some sort that the outbreak was largely in hand and about to turn over or be over. And we see the kind of collapse of all the other non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the sheltering in place, the mask mandates, the what's called the Tetris program, testing, tracing, and isolation. Here in the U.S., the kind of eviction moratoriums were allowed to go out. Whatever state wage support not only was allowed to end, but also were used as a battering ram, meaning as focused as the reason why we have this kind of labor shortage that was leading to the most terrible thing, like increasing wages so that people can actually pay their bills. So in essence, what we have here, it speaks directly to the ideologically based premises that are in action, right? So on one hand, we have the abandonment of public health as a kind of intervention, an intervention of the commons. Like that is not supportable at this point in terms of the ideological premises of both our countries, kind of a neoliberal program that everything gets monetized or destroyed. So there is on that end of it, and then of course hand in glove with that has been the long notion of the intended embrace of the kind of the large effect commoditizable and technological interventions that frankly few pathogens will fall to. Vaccines are wonderful. We should all be vaccinated, but it can only be a part of a larger program. And in the public health system, thinking, it's what's known as the Swiss cheese model. So you put one layer of Swiss cheese down, say the vaccines, has holes in it. So you need to do other interventions. So you put another layer of Swiss cheese. Perhaps it's targeted sheltering in place, and another layer, perhaps it's the mask mandates and the stay-at-home support, all those kinds of things, the tracing, the contact tracing, the isolation if necessary. So it's, when you have a stack of cheese, they all have holes in them, but the combination is what helps drive the pathogen down below its rate of replacement, such that you do at least have a kind of local extirpation, and the outbreak dies out, not merely in a matter of these kind of waves as all outbreaks go, but by virtue of the way that countries elsewhere have been able to show to be effective. But the problem is that it's not, the combinations is, of course, the public health commons we just talked about, and governance is directed around abandoning the notion that the populace must be cared for beyond their capacity to act as cheap labor, and that includes even for England. In Great Britain overall, the United States, the use of governance solely in the interests of the bourgeoisie to be able to continue to allow billionaires to make billions during a terrible outbreak such as COVID. So, and this frankly is what the left has always pushed for in reverse. On the one hand, against what we might call a kind of both a Trumpist and a right-wing aversion toward vaccinations and any public health intervention. There's also a quasi-left notion of the kind of natural immunity folk, natural health folk that are also opposed to him, very much the same crowd that was thought that vaccines cause autism and such. So this combination actually keeps us out from underneath any notion of the vaccination alone being enough to drive some relief and some even passing herd immunity. But a true left, and who am I to say what's true about this, but for the most part, the long left tradition of demanding and fighting for access to the latest medical intervention for all. And that isn't just within our countries, but globally. And we have a present situation where you have the same liberal class that has been here in the US punching down on Trumpists for not taking their vaccinations, also supporting the rights of the Bill Gates of the world to their intellectual property rights to be able to, in essence, force the WHO out of its initial model of open medicine, that all knowledge and all medical innovations would be made available to all for free. Gates did what he and his colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry did what they did for the HIV antiretroviral therapies. He basically went in there and basically turned the COVAX program into a deal between the pharmaceutical industry and who promised that they would give vaccines for 20% of the populations of the low-income countries that did not come to fruition, and the industries rolled back down to bilateral deals for countries that can afford it. So the left is in favor of those medical innovations, including vaccines, including the new anti-COVID drugs to be available to all. This is one means by which we can help drive COVID to zero in a way that presently it's just about impossible. And we're going to be caught in the washing machine of these cycles of outbreaks into years ahead. I remember seeing the first models of this that under the most terrible or pessimistic projections. I remember reading in middle of 2020, looking at us going through cycling through this to 2024. Some of the latest models, the pessimistic versions, have us at 2025. This is not something it's sustainable, particularly under this model. And I think what we have is the other, what we have here on the kind of the neoliberal model and under the Boris Johnson government was basically falling them back on what they proposed at the beginning of the outbreak, which was the kind of the notion of letting the virus rage through the population and getting people immunity that way. And of course, if you remember in the early days in which that was proposed, it was an outrage. The kind of harking back to the terrible Victorian models of who should live and who should die. And so, but we find ourselves circling back to that, if only by virtue of millions of people, not necessarily on the political right, exhausted by an outbreak that the government itself refused to actually engage. So this is the damage here, right? So going to let people out of their houses, which is completely understandable. It's been an exhausting experience for us all, but in a way that allows the pandemic to continue churning on. And there's the ideology of letting COVID make its way through anyway, and most people don't die anyway. And of course, unfortunately, something like 1 to 2%, certainly much better than 25 to 50% case fatality rate, can still do considerable damage, because a small proportion of a large number infected can still kill a lot of people. As I remember correctly, I think the official stats are at like 245 million people infected around the world. Even if that's 10 times off, and we're really at 2.5 billion people infected, that leaves still something like 5-6 billion people still uninfected. So in many ways, from the vantage point of the virus, we're still very much in early days yet. And this is the horror and terror of this presently. Again, much better than saying a case fatality rate of 25 or 50%. But so I said that on the left, we have two things. One, have the latest medical innovations for all. But two, that public health and environmental conservation that keep pathogens from the evolutionary space they need to repeatedly evolve these new variants. Also an important part of the left program in terms of intervening. So there was never a notion that vaccine was going to be enough, not even among the more middle of the road public health folk. There was always this notion that the Swiss cheese model was necessary. And among a smaller group of us, there was this notion that the kind of expropriation and the monetizing that is going on into the public health response within the global north is actually what drove the emergence of COVID in the first place. Now, before I get to some of the details of that, I just want to say one other point is that those countries that were able to do quite well in the year and a half, obviously New Zealand comes to mind, Iceland, Vietnam, China, increasingly Panama, Uruguay in the early days, but not so much anymore. Those countries have been battered, and they've been battered economically from their choices, although they also were doing better than many of the countries that allow things to be freewheeling and open. But there's a kind of secular trend of being somewhat in suffering from this. Also, their populations have increasingly rejected or objected to the kind of stay-at-home, sheltering in place orders and such. And so the way I interpreted it is that those countries that did nothing, or largely nothing, including the United States and Great Britain, in essence, battered those countries that were trying to do right by their population's public health. And so New Zealand is the classic example of now basically ending their broad efforts at this by virtue of actually doing a more comprehensive public health program. They ended up being kind of later in the line for the vaccines on the global stage. And the way I interpret it is the neoliberal countries, in essence, laid siege to these countries that were trying to do the right thing. In essence, were catapulting dead bodies over their city wall, in a kind of metaphorically speaking, in such a way that, being laid sieged by virtue of the failure of global solidarity to enact together, whether within country, the decisions here on the US against the mass mandates, whether the global stage, the Gates Foundation, or the Gates and the pharmaceutical companies refusing to distribute vaccines to all, those countries that have been able to do the right thing in terms of zero COVID were, in essence, have largely suffered by virtue of the length of time and the amount of COVID that's been circulating. So I'm trying to make this really brief, although I am a guy who talks a lot. I apologize for that part. But I thought speaking about this was important because the origins of COVID and as it relates to climate change are integrated with the ways our countries have decided to engage in public health. I mean, it's just basically rejection of the notion of the commons, whether within country or as a species, human species. The notion that yes, we are allowed to appropriate things from nature, and we are allowed to survive. There's nothing wrong with that. Earth is very much a regenerative system, capable of growing back from what we take. It's really a wonderful place to be. I like being on Earth. I like walking on the surface of the planet, and I don't have to wear a spacesuit. I like that 4 billion years of evolution led to my air packs being built into my chest, so I don't have to worry about putting them on. These are beautiful things, and it's nice to be here. And but the problem, of course, is that in my view and those of others, over the course of the development of civilization, yes, civilizations have risen and fallen, but often at the within the confines of our relationship or in the ecological matrix. So if, I know there's controversy over the notion of Easter Island, but, the collapse of the Roman Empire or ecological collapses that led from overly drawing from local resources. Yeah, but it's still very much within the context of the relationship that local populations had with their environment. Capitalism is an entirely different thing. It's based right up from the start, from the premise of kind of expropriating ecology, whatever the damage. And those is an alienation. We've alienated nature. We've alienated the labor. It's no longer appropriation. It's expropriation in such a way that we have all sorts of damage that accumulates. In the history of capitalism, our countries and others of the global north has been largely to leave the damage along the equator. So millions of people, black and brown, along the equator died. Millions died every year in the effort to basically expropriate resources that remain in place. We still have a relationship of 20% of the world's population using 80% of the world's resources. That continues today, and with the damage it causes. But in addition, catching our hand on the hot stove moment is that all of a sudden there's damage everywhere all at once, right? And the philosophers have a term for that. They call it a hyper object, something everywhere all at once. Pandemics are a good example of that. Climate change is another one. And so now, the system of expropriation that upon which the world system's organized has caused so much damage that we see our species in the target. The capacity of our species to socially reproduce itself from generation to generation is coming up against a variety of environmental precipices. And the COVID represents the kind of really flashy version of a signal that the damage that we've done to the environment is having this kind of blowback. I don't think of it in moralistic terms. I don't think of it in terms of Earth healing itself. I am very much in favor of humanity. I do think we have the capacity to think our way out of this, but it involves front and center, in essence, changing the system by which we reproduce ourselves. And it's doable. We've done so repeatedly over the many over 200,000 years of our existence as a species. It's just like the last 500 years have been a little hard, so it's like, and it's hard in part because those who are best getting the greatest resources out of it are those that can pay for the politicians that run things. So it's a political problem, very much. It's an ecological problem, it's an environmental problem, it's an epidemiological problem. It's not easy. We can figure those out. But ultimately, the big problem is the political part. I'll say a couple things about the origins of COVID. For the most part, I'm still very much in the camp that it rose out of bats in South and Central China, or perhaps now they're speaking about Laos. But for the most part, I would say it's a natural phenomenon, but it's very much in quotes. Although there are reasonable hypotheses about it emerging out of the Wuhan lab. It did take us 15 years to figure out how SARS-1 emerged. We should give ourselves patience, be patient about speaking about its origins. But the kind of field hypothesis that I'm a proponent of speaks to the relationship between COVID and climate change, in the sense of China, for instance, went through kind of its BRICS model of development, decided to pull itself out of poverty by exploiting itself and not letting the EU or the US do so. So it pulled millions out of poverty, left millions behind. I'm not here to get into that. But in the course of cutting into much of its forest, it increased the interface between many of the bats that were natural reservoirs for the coronaviruses. And you see, since the turn of the century, three major events, two of them in China, in which dangerous coronavirus spilled over into humans. One occurred in the Middle East, MERS, in 2012. And we have multiple documented spillover events of coronaviruses that didn't catch fire, but did get into human populations. So in essence, we have decided to intervene and plug ourselves in between the bats and the coronaviruses, who have a very tendentious relationship. It's like getting into the middle of a bar fight. Sometimes we want to break people up, but if two people are really going at it, you kind of want to step out and let professionals take care of it. But we intend to very much intervene in between there and allow multiple coronaviruses to spill over into our livestock that are encroaching on the last of the forest. Not only in China, this is happening everywhere. So there's a circuit of production there between the kind of regional capital and all the way to the local forest, through the peri-urban continuum back to the regional capital. And so some of these pathogens are emerging right at the forest edge. Coronaviruses come to mind, but Ebola is another example of that. And then you have pathogens that are more at the other end of that circuit. A lot of the industrial farms near these capitals, increasingly the world's encircled by cities of hog and cities of poultry. They're all monocultures that allow the avian influenzas and the swine influenzas and such to the African swine fevers to evolve and ramp up in their virulence. And also because of how integrated the world's travel and trade is, any virus along any of those circuits, whether it's Ebola at one end or even influenza at the other, you can infect local people, get on a plane and have margaritas in Miami Beach in a matter of weeks. So, what had been locally isolated all of a sudden has, even with very little evolution of these pathogens, can be on one side of the world or the other. So, Zika in Brazil, you have swine flu H1N1 outside Mexico City. You have Ebolas in Africa. You have H5N1s circulating around Europe. So it's not just a China thing at all, and it's really a global thing that requires a global intervention that we did not do very well this past year in terms of, because governance is organized around expropriation first. And expropriation is what, of course, has led to the emergence of these pathogens in the first place. And so you have a kind of a conceptual circle there that needs to be broken. Climate change is just the kind of biophysical example of this. Historically speaking, ecologies change all the time. Yes, atmosphere, you do have these atmospheric changes, but we're clearly on a accelerated schedule here, clearly man-made in terms of the impacts, and the damage to accrue is mind-boggling. There's an element of us, we're already in the accident, and that our face hasn't quite hit the windshield, although that is not true in many places of the world. Islands are going underwater, crops failing, ice caps melting, et cetera, et cetera. You all know the drill, you know where we're at. So I'll leave it at that. On that pleasant note, I will later return, I hope, to discuss ways out of this. But we have to be very upfront and discuss and be honest about the nature of the problem that we confront, both within our countries, whether it's directly speaking about COVID and the end of an attempt to abandon public health, all the way up through the origins of COVID as a marker of our means of social reproduction, and of course the larger danger of climate change. So I'm going to stop there.